If the global world order is in a state of flux, with old alliances tested and others being newly forged, then perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than in Ukraine. Ukraine has just seen the third anniversary of the invasion of its territory by Russian troops. That war had always been considered by Western powers, particularly those in Europe and Ukraine's steadfast military benefactor, the US, as a war of aggression by a belligerent Russia with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the helm. And while many of those European allies might continue to feel some version of that, in the White House, that picture now looks very different. From Washington and President Donald Trump, the message is now that the war has been drawn out for all these years because upstart Ukraine has refused to make a deal with its Russian neighbors, led by their unserious former comedian Volodymyr Zelensky. But there is nothing funny about the implications of this shift in thinking for Ukrainians and for Ukraine. As ever, on the last Friday of every month, the Lede hosts Global Insights, the current affairs show hosted by my colleague Kwangu Liwewe. On this episode of Global Insights, Kwangu brought onto the podcast New Lines' global news editor Amie Ferris-Rotman and Mykhaylo Shtekel, a Ukrainian journalist who acts as media coordinator for the Reckoning Project, to discuss how these geopolitical shifts will affect this protracted and brutal conflict. And in a sign of just how fast Ukraine's reality is changing, since recording the episode earlier in the week, Ukraine has suggested it may actually sign a major new minerals deal with the United States. I've asked Amie back onto the podcast to discuss that deal. Amie, first of all, what can you tell us about the details behind the deal? It's now Thursday, and we think Zelensky may be in Washington even tomorrow morning. What do we know about what's been agreed so far?
That's the plan. And this is a fast-moving story and keeps changing all the time. But that's what we know at the moment, which is Zelensky is going to Washington with various ministers and various high-ranking people of his government to meet Trump. And they're meant to ink a deal that would give the US access to its deposits of rare earth minerals, as well as some gas and some oil. That is what we've understood, yeah.
And quite a big deal. I mean, the way Zelensky describes it, of course, the numbers are pretty incredible, but the way Zelensky describes it, he said the deal would mean that 10 generations of Ukrainians would be paying it back.
Yeah, I mean, no one knows the numbers, and Trump threw around some numbers about how much the military aid cost the United States that Washington has given Ukraine, and it was 10 times more than what Zelensky says it is. So yeah, there are huge discrepancies in how much aid, the cost of the aid that the United States has given Ukraine, which is essentially what this deal is about. It's about paying, quote unquote, paying back Washington, even though the aid was at the time given to Ukraine. It was not a loan. But Zelensky is, it appears, going along with this.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what is so interesting about what's going on, that it signals an ideological shift as well. Because as you say, the money originally under the Biden administration wasn't meant to be a loan. It was meant to be money that the Americans gave the Ukrainians to defend themselves. But now, because Trump is known as a transactional president, but this, I guess I heard this described as a guns for resources deal. That's about as good a descriptor of what's going on as you can ask for.
Very much so. I mean, or his critics, Trump's critics would go further and call it extortion. Because
I mean, you're not really leaving the Ukrainians much choice to sign this deal.
I mean, it certainly would appear that they do not have much choice. Yeah, exactly. Zelensky, who has been the figurehead at the top representing Ukraine throughout this full-scale invasion, he's repeatedly said there will not be concessions of land. He's repeatedly said that all he wants is to end the war. So you get the impression that he does not do things lightly. I mean, he's obviously looked at this properly, but also realizes that he is perhaps cornered.
Yeah. Amie, thank you for coming back.
Sure. Yeah, it's good to be back.
Here's today's episode of Global Insights on the Lead.
Thank you, Amie and Mykhaylo, for joining me on the podcast. Amie, I will start with you. There's a clear ideological shift in Washington's relationship with Ukraine. How is this manifested in terms of what military aid is sent to Ukraine now?
It's a massive shift indeed. And I mean, as far as the United States is concerned, there will be no more military aid sent to Ukraine from the United States. Instead, they want the opposite. I mean, they want it all in some way, quote unquote, paid back, is what President Trump has asked for. So in terms of US support, that seems to be coming to a very abrupt end, and now it will be up to Europe to provide military aid, if indeed military aid is needed, which I would argue it is, of course. I don't see things suddenly changing overnight.
Amie, just to take you back to the relationship, Washington's relationship with Ukraine, the individual who best personifies that changing relationship is surely Volodymyr Zelensky. If we look back to just over 2 years ago, Zelensky was giving at least 10 standing ovations while he addressed the US Congress. Is it almost impossible to imagine what's happening now? I mean, given the falling out with Trump. So to what extent is what's happening between the US and Russia the result of the changing political situation? Or is it the changing political situation that's brought it about because of the difficult relationship between Trump and Zelensky?
As much as President Trump, I'm sure, would like to blame the change in Washington's relationship with Kyiv on Zelensky, I would argue that no, it's not really much to do with Zelensky, and it's more to do with Putin and Trump. During Trump's first term, and I was in Moscow reporting on this day in and day out, trying to, find the links between Putin and Trump in those days, which no one could identify. Now that we're in Trump 2.0, he seems to have no qualms about being Putin's buddy. And that means completely changing what the US is doing in Ukraine and US's support for Ukraine. It doesn't help that Volodymyr Zelensky is not going to stand by and let Trump insult him and insult his country and dictate terms in the way he's been doing. So if someone says no to Trump, especially a leader, he doesn't take kindly to that. He reacts, as time has shown again and again, he doesn't react favorably to people who tell him no.
Mykhaylo, following up on that, how has that change in policy been felt in Ukraine?
Trump became a president in the very crucial moment from the Russian-Ukrainian war perspective. We are having the full-scale Russian invasion since February 2022, and we need to understand the reality of the front line. Ukrainian army needs more people, more shells, more techniques, and the needs are rising throughout these 3 years. And Trump became the president at the moment when we need more and more and more if we are trying to reach the tasks we declared we are trying to have, like restoring of the sovereignty of the country and going to the borders of the 1991 and so on and so on. So at the moment when we actually needed the support, Trump became a president. And actually from that very moment, it was a big question and a big challenge for Ukrainian government and for Ukrainian army and for the regular Ukrainians what's going to happen, because everybody understood that something will happen anyway. I mean, whether Trump is going to cut the support at once, which he didn't do, or he will try to push us somewhere to end the war at any terms. So now we are having the situation when we are trying to bargain for the conditions which are better for us and worse for Russians. But the situation is still unstable. I mean, as far as I understand, we are still receiving US military support. But to be frank, it was never in the volumes which we actually needed throughout these 3 years. And it was never at the time when we actually needed that. And we even had the pause of the few months when we needed some artillery shells, which we didn't get. And because of this pause, we actually lost a few important points, like some of Ukrainian towns, which are now occupied by Russian army because of that pause, because we didn't have these artillery shells where we needed them actually. So the situation is really unstable and very challenging. And what I see now is just like bargaining about how we are going to stop and where we are going to stop and on what conditions.
Mykhaylo, you've painted a picture for us saying, you need more people, you need more shells. But in terms of the war, do you think it's stuck in a deadlock, or is one side now starting to gain the upper hand?
The war didn't stuck at the deadlock, like at all. Russians are moving, they're moving quite slowly because first, Ukrainian army is trying to defend the country and to defend the territory. And Russians have to use lots of human resources and lots of techniques to advance, but they do advance. Not very fast, but they are advancing. So it's not deadlocked. It's just a matter of very, very slow movement of Russian army in the direction of Ukrainian cities.
Now, in terms of the Ukrainian land that is currently occupied by Russia, just tell us how much of that land has been taken.
It's not about the quantity of the territory, it's about the strategic importance of that territory. At the moment, Russia gained the entrance to Crimea, the land entrance to Crimea, and they are trying to push back from the Donbas, which we still control, and from Kharkiv region, to create this security zone between Russian territory and Ukrainian controlled territory. So about 1/5 of the Ukrainian territory is occupied, a little bit more.
Okay. Amie, I'll turn to you now. Could you tell us about how this war continues to be received in Russia? It really wasn't intended to last this long.
No, it was certainly not intended to last this long, which is down to Russian hubris. They thought it would be extremely quick. They thought it would be a very short operation, that they would simply go in and ride victorious to Kyiv. Then the Ukrainian people showed them very quickly that that was not to be the case. Russia's lost a huge amount of men. Obviously, these figures are not publicly disclosed, but recent data analysis by the BBC puts it at 95,000 men who have been killed, actually killed, not just casualties, including the injured. And I mean, that's a huge amount. To put it into perspective, the Soviet Union fought a war in Afghanistan for 10 years in the 1980s, one of the major contributing factors of the fall of the Soviet Union, and that was 14,000 Soviet troops who died. Disproportionate amount, actually, who were Ukrainian. But just to give you an idea, so 95,000 men have been killed, and also Russia has been completely changed by this war, at least until President Trump decided to extend his olive branch to Putin. But, I mean, we can talk about the sanctions as well. I mean, that Russia economically and politically has been isolated on the world stage to an extent that we haven't seen since the Cold War days, since over 30 years ago.
Yes, you've talked about the human cost and the lives lost. What about Putin's political stability? How much is this war costing him in terms of politics?
I mean, there's sort of two camps when it comes to this. One camp says that Putin's grip on power is now intrinsically linked to the war in Ukraine. And so as long as the war in Ukraine continues and as long as Putin conveys to his country, and of course you have to understand that there's no such thing as independent Russian media anymore, at least not independent Russian media that's in the country. So everything that gets conveyed to the Russian people is propaganda, will be augmented, will not be the truth. And so as long as this is portrayed as a success, which is how, of course, it is being portrayed to the Russian people, then Putin will stay most likely in power. I mean, I don't have a magic wand or a crystal ball, and I don't want to make predictions about when Putin will stop ruling Russia, because that's really anyone's guess. I'm certainly not privy to any kind of movement on that front. But there's also the other camp, which says that Putin's power is on tenterhooks, that he's holding on tenterhooks because the war is emptying Russia of men, of money, and all sorts of assets as well, and political clout on the world stage, and that his days are numbered in power. So it's basically one of those two options.
Okay, you've just touched briefly on money, and when we look at the sanctions, they were really meant to squeeze Russia's economy. But in your opinion, have they actually worked, or did Moscow find a way around them?
They worked on some levels. I mean, I spent a long time in Russia, and watching Russia today, it's actually extraordinary to see a country which does not have any of the Western businesses that it did have, which Putin and all his guys worked so hard to bring into Russia to get it out of the 1990s poverty and chaos and mayhem that it experienced after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So many Western companies have since pulled out due to the invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There's since 2022, when Russia invaded the US, the UK, EU, Australia, Canada, Japan have imposed more than 16,500 sanctions on Russia. So that's a lot, and a lot of money has come out, or not come out, has been frozen as a result. Oligarchs who control a lot of the Russian economy have not been allowed to access their accounts abroad. So all of that is extremely important, but Russia has still managed to sell a lot of oil abroad. And it's done this through a shadow fleet of about 1,000 tankers. This is according to the Atlantic Council. And it's selling it illegally. Russia has also managed to prop up various African countries' regimes in exchange for mineral wealth. Again, talking about mineral wealth as a bargaining chip. Yeah, so Russia has done better than I think the countries imposing the sanctions hoped it would do.
And yet, in the same breath, Ukraine is struggling to keep up the fight financially. How does this compare to Russia's ability to keep funding its war efforts? Mykhaylo, do you have a comment on this?
Yes, we heavily depend on the military assistance from the West, to be fair. However, during last year, it was mainly Ukrainian-made weapons which actually stopped the Russian army. First-person view drones and other drones, and they are being produced in Ukraine, in some cases even from Ukrainian-made details, not Chinese-made details, which is a great step forward. And that's the thing we do not depend on US or countries of European Union. I know that United States and UK provided Ukrainian army with some quantity of the drones to hit Russian techniques and Russian personnel. But as far as I understand, it's Ukrainian-made drones, which now actually aim their tanks, armored vehicles, and so on and so on. And they provide something like 80% of hit targets. These are targets hit by drones. So that's our big and good, strong hand. But anyway, we need artillery shells and artillery units and tanks and other heavy machinery. And here we depend on the Western support. And also the very important capability we miss is air defense units. I'm sure that everyone who watches the situation knows how crucially for us is getting Patriot systems or SAMP-T systems or IRIS systems for defending Ukrainian cities and for defending Ukrainian energy facilities, which are being hit by a Russian army. So we do not have our own air defense systems capable of hitting Russian missiles. So that's a very important part of our defense, which we depend on Western assistance on.
Okay, Mykhaylo and Amie, let's now move to the wider geopolitical situation. And apart from the heavy toll on people and economies, which we've just discussed, this war has also shaken up global politics. And this was perhaps best demonstrated just this week at the United Nations, where we saw the US join Russia, Belarus, and North Korea to vote against a resolution demanding that Russia immediately withdraw from Ukraine. Amie, what are you reading into this with regards to the shifting sands of global alliances?
I mean, to be honest, I just shock. I'm still in a state of shock by how the Trump administration is reacting. If you looked at that board of all of the countries that said no, that they will not support Ukraine, it really looked like the United States had entered something which it itself has called the axis of evil. So, up there with North Korea, Belarus, all these countries, Venezuela. So beyond shock, I suppose it means we're going to see a world where authoritarian regimes are able to do what they want. Russia just must be laughing with happiness.
Mykhaylo, what's your take on it? The axis of evil, as Amie says.
It's hard for me to actually comment on that, to be fair. I mean, I'm not living in the United States and I'm not feeling everything which United States citizens feel at the moment. I can only say that I could see this shift after the elections where Trump won, but it was not only Trump, actually. I mean, as far as I understand, great quantity of state councils, state senates, local councils, other political bodies, you could see this shift everywhere. I mean, from Democratic to Republicans. And surely it changes a lot. It really changes a lot. However, if the shift is so big, it means that there was some demand for that shift. On our end in Ukraine, it influences the whole situation. Surely it influenced the whole situation. I couldn't, for example, imagine how we are trying to cope with the war with Russia, like we coped throughout all these years. And we didn't have enough support. I mean, not enough support to win, possibly. Not enough support to break the defense of Russian troops. It's hard for me to imagine Ukrainian army trying to fight Russia without the full support of the West, because the situation was quite strange, actually. I mean, we needed to defend, our army needed to defend the country. We needed to somehow overthrow Putin regime. We needed somehow to disrupt the Russian Federation from inside, actually. But I can't say that the support even in 2022 was enough to do that. It created the impression, actually, that everybody was waiting for Putin to cool down and to back off. But he didn't. He didn't do that. And I don't know what could be the situation if, I mean, not Trump won. And so the situation stays a little bit the same. But how it will influence the Russian-Ukrainian war, it's hard for me to say.
And just recently, the US and Russia held talks in Saudi Arabia, but Ukraine wasn't even at the table. Surely Kyiv feels like it's been sidelined in these negotiations.
I really think, actually, that it wasn't very polite. I mean, I can't say that Trump or his people, they actually behave like diplomats. They are not Talleyrand. However, I'm almost sure that actually Ukraine was not the top topic for them to discuss, to be fair. It could be China, it could be energy, it could be like security situation. And I'm afraid that Ukraine is not the most important problem for Trump to solve. It could be Africa, for example, or China, which is very crucial for the global geopolitical security situation. I'm afraid that we are not so important at that moment.
Amie, what's your take on Ukraine not being at the table of discussions in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I agree with Mykhaylo. It was extremely impolite. It's also the sort of thing the United States has done in the past. I mean, trying to talk about how to deal with a so-called problem or a resolution to a war or a conflict in a country without members of that country being present. I'm thinking about Afghanistan. Namely, of course, Afghanistan, the US would often meet with its NATO partners to discuss the fate of the country without anyone representing the Afghan government being present. And people can say that that is one of the reasons that was so disastrous. So we have seen other US actors be like this in the past. Obviously, it's impolite, it's rude, and it's really poor diplomacy. Yeah, even if, as Mykhaylo says, and even if Ukraine was not high up on the agenda of Putin and Trump, it's still just very poor diplomacy.
Yeah. And then the US President Trump again keeps on saying that this wouldn't have happened if he was in charge. When it broke out 3 years ago, he blames former US President Biden, he blames Zelensky, but he doesn't blame Putin. How does this message impact Putin's strategy going forward, Amie?
Well, that's very convenient for Putin, isn't it? I mean, it's just absolutely... Well, first of all, it's just not true. Well, we don't know if it's true or not, actually, of course, but I doubt it because Putin was set on invading Ukraine. But in terms of how does this messaging impact Putin's strategy, Trump is a transactional guy, right? He's not dovish. A lot of people say, oh, he's dovish, he's against war. I mean, it's true that he doesn't like wars, but I think that's because he probably thinks they're a waste of money. It's actually, they often are for many actors. But I think that Putin will see this as he himself operates sometimes, which is transactional. Putin is probably thinking, oh, okay, great, I got off scot-free here. How can I use this to manipulate, or how can I use the US government to get maximum concessions or maximum amount of what I want out of Ukraine? So, yeah, they both are transactional in that respect.
Now, Mykhaylo, Zelensky says he's willing to step down if it means securing NATO membership for Ukraine. In your opinion, is this a genuine offer for peace, or is it a sign of how desperate the situation has become?
That could be a way out, actually. I mean, the personality of Zelensky is something which irritates Trump and Putin both. But anyway, it's not very, like, you cannot hold any elections and you cannot do anything with politics until you have security guarantees. And Ukraine cannot hold elections until the martial law status is stopped. And we cannot stop it until actually we have security guarantees. So it's like what's been earlier, chicken or an egg. You cannot make another president instead of Zelensky until war is over. But we don't have security guarantees because of Zelensky to end the war. We need to have security guarantees not because of Zelensky, but because of Ukraine and Ukrainian security.
How much of this is about securing Ukraine's future or navigating international politics when we hear Zelensky say he's willing to step down?
I really think that it's kind of bargaining from Trump and from Zelensky and from Putin. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like Trump is trying to sell the heavily used car to somebody and he needs to bargain a lot to push it into the hands of the buyer. And he will say anything to push Ukraine and Zelensky into the deal. And now Zelensky is trying, as far as I see, do the same, actually, the same strategy. He's looking quite decent from my personal point of view. But the whole strategy is like just bargaining. And until we don't have the full information on the deal, we don't have the full text of the deals which were suggested to Ukraine and pushed by Trump to sign, we don't understand the whole situation. And until we don't understand the whole situation, all these, words told by Trump or told by Zelensky, they don't add up to the understanding of the situation. I really hope that some media or somebody will leak the texts of these deals, and we will have possibility to look at them fully and to understand what they are all about.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a bargaining chip. Trump accuses him of being a dictator, so he says, he basically says the thing which is the least dictatorish thing he can say, which is, okay, fine, I'll step down. I'll step down. I mean, it's obvious that they didn't have elections because it's a war, and as various people on all sorts of social media and all sorts of think tanks pointed out, that's kind of standard when you're on a war footing and when you have martial law as well.
Okay, so now looking forward, what would a Trump peace deal actually mean for NATO, Europe, and for global security, Mykhaylo?
It depends on the conditions, and I think he's trying to earn money. I mean, that's how his mind works: to earn money, to save budget spending, and to earn money for US. So possibly selling weapons. I mean, trying to push European Union to defend Ukraine by themselves and selling them weapons to do that. I mean, air jets, HIMARSes, anything which is costly and unique for United States military production complex. To put European soldiers to be here and to sell weapons for them to guarantee the security of Ukraine sounds legit and sensible from his point of view. And the whole NATO situation, it's more complicated. I remember that during the first term, Trump was the one actually who pushed Europe to spend more money on security. And it was really a good, from my point of view, step. Because despite the Russian aggression in 2014 in Ukraine, Europe didn't rise spending more governmental spending on the security. Germany or France or Italy, they didn't start to spend more money to guarantee the security of their country and Europe itself. So during the first term, Trump pushed NATO countries to spend more money on security. And even after that, there were a few reports about gruesome state of the German military, especially German army. tanks and so on. They didn't have enough money to keep their techniques in the decent condition. So that's a challenge. And such behavior of Trump may be an additional push for European countries to be more security-minded.
And Amie, just picking up on that, I mean, nothing in politics is ever given for free. And Mykhaylo has talked about Trump wanting to gain more money. If you had to spell it out to him, what would you say the US was gaining from the billions of dollars of military aid? And what would it stand to lose if that funding was completely cut off?
It's a hard one because I don't actually think, even if it was spelled out to Trump, that he would understand it or agree. Otherwise, he wouldn't have acted like this. I mean, if he believes completely erroneously that this war was started by Ukraine, then why even try spell it out to him? I mean, it's pretty obvious that Ukraine needed to be defended and to be given aid and to be helped, because a sovereign nation in Europe had been attacked without any provocation. So if that's not clear to him in terms of European security, in terms of not emboldening a country like Russia, you know, a nuclear power, from attacking its neighbor, then I don't know what you can explain to him, really.
Yeah, but after all this bloodshed, billions have been spent and countless failed negotiations over the 3 years. What does a realistic end to this war look like to you, Mykhaylo?
It's a very complicated question. You understand that. For me, the freezing of this conflict would be satisfying, at least, if we at least would not be pushed into lying. I mean, the whole narrative that Ukraine somehow provoked Russia to attack, doesn't matter in 2014 or in 2022, is absolute lie. And whatever problems we had in 2014 or 2022, it does not give any rights to Kremlin to start the war, actually. And for me, the satisfying end or a break of this military aggression would be at least not to have to lie that Ukraine provoked, or we somehow deserve what Russian military did here. And that's the main threat, I think, for us, that we will be pushed into a narrative that Russia is not guilty and we provoked it, and they just wanted to defend anything, doesn't matter what. But I don't think that these actions can anyhow be understandable.
And Amie, what's your take on a realistic end to this war? What do you think it will look like?
Oh, I mean, realistic to whom, I suppose, is the question. As Mykhaylo said, for him, as a Ukrainian, the hardest thing at stake would be a rewriting of history. So much of this war has been about the battle for history. I mean, history that's being created, but also the past. But in terms of a realistic one that I think it may end up happening is, unfortunately, I imagine Ukraine will have to concede some land. I know that Ukrainians obviously feel, as they should, extremely upset about this, but that is what it looks like is going to happen. I assume that especially places that Russia occupied in 2014, such as Crimea, such as the east, like Donetsk, Donbass, I assume that these parts of Ukraine will either be, well, they formally made parts of Russia. I mean, Crimea already has, according to the Russians only. But I assume there will be some sort of internationally monitored border, like fake border. I just don't know, you know, like the United Kingdom, where I live, has said that they're willing to put boots on the ground as a sort of international peacekeeping force. Maybe we'll see something like that. But if we're talking about something realistic happening, I assume, as things are going at the moment, it looks like Russia is going to get something that it should not get.
Mykhaylo and Amie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Global Insights on the Lead from New Lines Magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you'll find global insights the last Friday of every month. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, please rate us and leave a review. It really helps us to grow our audience. Thank you for joining us.